In this topic, we will look at the Prince2 risk management procedure. There are a number of steps for managing risk. Here we can see the first three steps. We identify, assess, and plan. When identifying risks, we determine what specific threats and opportunities the project may be faced with and accurately record those risks. When assessing risks, we evaluate the probability, impact, and timing of each individual risk, and then examine the overall risk profile for the project. This can provide a snapshot of how risky the project may or may not be. When planning risks, we develop management responses to the threats and opportunities because there must be a way to deal with each risk that has been identified in the event it should occur. The next two steps are to implement and communicate. When implementing risks, we turn the previously documented plans into action, ensuring that everyone is clear on what needs to be done when dealing with the risk that has occurred. When communicating risks, we let the stakeholders know about threats and opportunities and make sure that we get the right people actively engaged in the process. Here is a visual representation of the risk management procedure. It includes the 5 steps previously mentioned, which are identify, assess, plan, implement, and communicate. Note that this is an iterative process and that communication is something that is done throughout the project. Here is another visual representation of the steps for managing risk. The following slides will provide further detail about each of these steps. When identifying risks, we first need to think about the context of the project. What is the project that we are working on? What are the objectives of the project, and which of those objectives are at risk? We also need to create a risk management strategy. The risk management strategy is a how-to document. It explains how risk will be managed throughout the project and who is responsible for managing each risk. We then need to identify the risks, which compose both opportunities and threats in a project. For each of these types of risk, we must identify the cause of the risk, the uncertain event itself, and the impact on the project if it were to occur. The risks can be stated as per the template provided, which includes the risk cause, risk event, and risk impact. Using this template can assist with identifying risks and communicating risks to all stakeholders. Once the risks have been identified, they should then be entered into the project's risk register. The risk register is a document that has a record of all project risks and associated information. An example of a risk register and its contents will be provided in topics to follow. Here is an example of how to express risk. We provide the risk cause, the risk event, and then the risk effect. So a risk cause, the source, may result in a risk event, threat or opportunity, which may cause a risk effect, impact on an objective. Here are 2 examples of expressing risk. The first example represents a threat, while the second example represents an opportunity. The first example states that due to the local climate, there is a risk to rain which will have the following impact. 1. 50% less people will visit the event. 2. The event will lose a certain amount of money. The second example states that due to the local climate, there may be an opportunity of sunny weather, which will 1. Increase the number of people by 20%, and 2. Increase the drink revenue by 60%. So the rain can provide a threat to the project, and the sunny weather can provide an opportunity. Identifying and understanding how to deal with risks, regardless of whether they provide an opportunity or a threat, can play a significant part in the success or failure of a project. There are a number of techniques available to identify risks. These include lessons learned from previous projects, brainstorming techniques, a risk workshop or risk identification session, checklists, performance indicators, a risk breakdown structure, a SWOT analysis, or an Ishikawa diagram. These techniques can be used on their own or in combination. So you don't necessarily need to use one technique. you can use multiple techniques to help you identify the risks for a project. Risks can also be identified according to specific categories, and the example shown here uses the PESTLE technique to assist with identifying risks. PESTLE stands for political, economic, sociological, technological, legal, and environmental. So when identifying risks, you would list each of these categories and then try to identify risks specific to each category. PESTLE analysis is only one type of categorization. There are many other different types of categorization. By providing risk categories, it can assist with comprehensively identifying the types of risks that can occur in a project. Here is an example of what each of the PESTLE categories means. For example, political risks represent the current and potential influences from political pressures. Technological risks represent the effect of new and emerging technology, and legal risks represent the effect of national and world legislation. Once we have identified the risks, we move on to assessing the risks. We need to determine the probability of how likely a risk is to happen, determine the impact or effect it will have on the project, and the proximity of the risk. In other words, how soon is the risk likely to take place if nothing is done? These are three of the columns that should be provided in the risk register. There are various techniques for estimating risks, and several of those techniques are listed here. Examples include probability trees, expected value, Pareto analysis, and a probability impact grid. Estimating provides a mechanism to assess the probability, impact, and proximity for each threat or opportunity. Here is a very simple but effective risk assessment technique where a risk is awarded a score for its probability and impact using a simple scale and professional judgment. The impact could be negative or positive, hence the two impact columns and the one probability of occurrence column. A total risk score is calculated for each risk by multiplying the probability score by the impact score, which may be negative or positive. For example, a threat with a 50-50 chance of occurring and a serious impact would have a score of -12, 3 times -4. An opportunity with a very unlikely occurrence and a substantial positive impact would have a score of 5, 1 times 5. Once scores have been calculated for each risk, they can be sorted to reveal which threats and opportunities are top candidates for action. Risk evaluation helps to describe the net effect of all project risks, as well as revealing the overall risk severity of a project. Here is an example of a probability impact grid, which is a popular visual representation of the categorization of risks in a project. One side of the grid represents the probability of a risk occurring, and the other side represents the impact of the risk. Other information that is shown includes specific actions that can be taken, depending on where a risk sits within the grid. Potential actions could be to accept the risk, be proactive about the risk, or escalate it to the project board. Another technique that can be used to evaluate risks is to prepare a project risk summary or profile. This example is similar to the previous one, which has a probability and impact, but the scales used are different. In addition, this example also has the actual risks shown on the diagram, a threshold for when the risks should be escalated to the project board, as well as the potential to show trends of risks moving from one part of the grid to another. At this stage of the risk management process, we have identified and assessed the project risks. It's now time to plan responses for the risks. There are 9 categories of risk response within the PRINCE2 risk management framework. They can be responses for threats, opportunities, or both threats and opportunities. The threat responses are avoid, reduce, fallback, transfer, share, and accept. The opportunity responses are exploit, enhance, share, and reject. Additional information will be provided for each of these responses in slides to follow. To avoid a threat, a change is made, for example to the project scope, to remove the threat or neutralise its effect on project objectives. By taking these steps, the uncertain event can never occur. To reduce a threat, action is taken to reduce either the probability or the impact of the risk. A fallback response to a risk is also referred to as a contingency plan. The fallback response is performed only if the risk occurs and is therefore reactive rather than proactive. As a result, it does not affect risk probability but mitigates its impact. With a transfer response, the financial impact of a risk can partly be transferred to a third party. Accepting a risk is a conscious decision to do nothing. If a risk is accepted, then the situation must be monitored carefully to make sure that the risk does not move beyond an acceptable level of probability or impact. The previous slides provided details about the responses for threats. Here are some responses for opportunities. An exploit response results in action to force the risk event to occur. An enhanced response is a proactive response, increasing either the probability or impact of the risk, which is the direct opposite to the reduced response. A reject response is a conscious decision to do nothing. In some situations, it may be preferable not to exploit, enhance the risk. Here is a response for both threats and opportunities. With a share response, the customer and supplier can choose to share the gain if costs are lower than planned, and the pain if costs exceed what was expected. This response is usually performed before the risk event. Let's now consider what happens in the implement stage of the risk management process. At this point, each risk is assigned a risk owner. The risk owner assists the project manager with getting a risk response implemented. The risk owner is responsible for maintaining the project's understanding of the risk and for ensuring that the selected processes for responding to the risk are carried out. The risk owner may be supported by a risk actionee. The risk actionee is assigned to carry out one or more of the risk response actions under the direction of the owner. The risk owner and risk actionee may also be the same person. The final stage of the risk management process is to communicate risks. Communication is crucial in any project and should be done on many levels and to all stakeholders involved in a project. Communication activities should be performed continually, including communicating risk information to project team members and stakeholders external to the project. There are a number of strategies available to communicate risk information. Prince2 recommends several management products called checkpoint and highlight reports, end stage and end project reports, exception reports, and a lessons report. Some less formal methods can also be used to communicate risks, including meetings and memos.